Now we have the second laureate, Professor Bengt Holmström. We are very pleased to have you here as well. So welcome.
Yes, so thank you for inviting me and to speak here. I have been talking so much about these agency problems that I decided to do something a little different. So this is not my lecture from the Nobel Prize. It is the lecture that will attempt to get the second Nobel Prize. So I'm already working on the next thing, looking forward. So the title is The Promises and Perils of Money Markets, and actually it is a lecture that I gave Munich lectures for a month ago or so, but it's a project I've been working fairly intensely with Gary Gorton and Trivi Dang. They are not cited here, but I should say that at the outset. It's actually related in some ways to the financial part of Oliver's lecture, but it's a rather different take. It's not emphasizing control rights, it's emphasizing liquidity. So this is a lecture really driven by the idea of, is this the thing that's working? Okay. Driven by the financial crisis. It started with the financial crisis. So I will start by saying a few words. My view is that people still haven't really analyzed the deeper sources behind the financial crisis. They are still at the stage where most of it is blamed on the common view, of course, is here Wall Street greed and wrong incentives. Complex instruments created, asset-backed securities that were opaque, and therefore nobody understood exactly what was going on. Poor and complicit ratings, meaning that the ratings agencies that were supposed to judge these instruments that were being traded and used as collateral in various agreements, they were just tilted in favor of AAA, that is the highest value debt instruments. And I don't know how many have seen the Big Short movie. Okay, so that's a perfect setup for me because it's perfectly wrong. Well, it is serious. Michael Lewis is a fine writer, and I think he was very sincerely looking into it. But it sort of illuminates this general view of the crisis. His book, in my way, is really trying to answer one question, or the conclusion somehow from Michael's book was, how could Wall Street trade without knowing really anything? And those who saw the movie knows that, 5 guys went out to Florida and, asked people about, knocked on the doors and so on. And that's all it took to understand that things were really wrong. And so there's the universal call, I would say, for more transparency. So there's a lot of questions about how should we deal with it. One thing is sort of almost universally agreed. We got to get more transparent about these instruments so that people would understand things better. I think I would emphasize that there is a need for transparency in various places, but sort of thinking that the solution to these debt contract instruments and trading them is transparency is antithetical to the whole idea of money markets. That's going to be my main point. And so the alternative view I'm putting is that in money markets, the central idea is that you set up a contract and you choose your collateral in such a manner that you don't have to ask any questions. That is the whole idea. So Wall Street wasn't, stupid. Of course, they first of all knew a lot more than what the book really reveals. Secondly, they did trade, and when you have people trade billions of dollars, you have to understand it was within Wall Street that they traded. it's for any social scientist to think that 5 people understood it and the rest of these guys, highly incentivized guys, either was in some kind of big, gigantic collusion or just were stupid or ignorance. That just defies, you know, if that's the way the world runs, I think we are in real trouble. We may be in real trouble, but I don't think that's the reason. So Bagehot, who was an English writer or economist, I guess, or was it a banker, he said already in the 1800s, every banker knows that if he has to prove he's worthy of credit, in fact, his credit is already gone. So what does this sentence mean? It means that if I have to somehow start to prove to you that I'm credit worthy, that my paper is good, my debt obligations are good, at that point it's over. And this is this even before the crisis, and as this statement makes clear, this is really a foundation. And so the question is, how is it possible that you trade in so little information, that's the whole idea? Or as I put it, or somebody else has also put it, ignorance is almost bliss. And it isn't meaning that we should create it ignorance, it's just that people don't have the incentive to find out information. It's structured to be that way. And so just before I go on, and this is of course an economics crowd to some extent, so I don't need to explain perhaps much, but I just want to make sure that I'm talking about the money markets. Money markets are, generally speaking, short-term debt, usually under one year at least, but very often, you know, overnight, a huge part is just overnight loan, interbank loans, and so on. Low risk, highly liquid, a lot of it treasuries, agency CDs, commercial papers, and repos were very important, repurchase agreements, which I will come to just in the next slide. But this is a gigantic market. You have to understand that we talk about stock market 90% of the time. This is the 90% of what's happening is in the money markets. This is just the blood that's flowing through the system. So these are orders of magnitude bigger in volume, these markets. The units of trade and so on are huge, and I come to that later. And there's also a lot of innovation, but I won't speak about that. So what I want to talk about is the pawn shop, just as a starting sort of example, because this is the point I want to make is this logic of low information is extremely old. And so pawn shops have been around for over thousands of years, you know. And I want to bring up the logic of the pawn shop, which is that what the aim of the pawn shop is, of course, I need money. And the question is, how could I get it? I could take my watch or my grandfather's watch and I could sell it, or some item that is worthwhile. But it may well have a higher value for me than for the person that I'm selling it to. And if we may have a difficulty reaching an agreement for that reason or other reasons, or what the value of the price is. Bilateral, notice, we are just 2 people, so there is no market for this directly, this item. And so the brilliant solution behind this pawn shop, the simple but brilliant solution, is that we don't have to agree to the price. You say $100, I think it's $500. Well, if I only need $100, you know, money, then we agree on $100. But with a qualification, I can buy my watch back in a month or 30, you know, 15 days or whatever the term is, for $100 plus interest. So the idea is that we don't start haggling out what is exactly the value of the price. This is a first step to understanding how money markets work. They obviate price discovery. And it is, as I said, age-old, and that means it's a very robust logic. You know, this has been used in different countries. It's the most natural. We could call it a securitized loan, but I want to emphasize the aspect that we don't have to price the collateral in a securitized loan. I have a mortgage. You know, it doesn't really matter. It's not crucial to know the exact value of the house. All you need to know, there's enough value to fairly safely cover the loan. That's the fundamental logic. So that's the idea of no price discovery. And the repo market, which is a modern version of it, that is literally of selling and buying, so it's very similar to the pawn shop. This is a gigantic $3 trillion market, over $1 trillion every day turning over, you know, because most of such a big part of it is overnight. And it's a wholesale funding market for the for the banks and such. And by the way, the Fed operates in the market. So the unit of trade, just to get your sense, is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So the government, when it carries out its, or the Fed that carries out its open market operations, we are talking about billions of dollars. So the unit of trade is $1 billion. And it should be clear, and this is an important point here, there is no deposit insurance that will deal with it. So these markets evolved before the financial crisis very much to create safe parking space for a lot of, say, the Asian money that flowed in. I leave it this, but there's a logical story about this market that came, really started growing in the late 80s and through the 90s and so on, and overtook the whole traditional banking system in terms of size and volume and importance. That had to do with this yearning for putting money somewhere, because if you have $1 billion, which some people these days actually have, there's a problem. You know, where do I park it so that it's available for me tomorrow as well? But even $1 million is a problem, or a couple of $1 million, and many people, including Oliver, has that kind of money. You know, so he should be worried. He probably has it parked in his house, which is so good. So the repo market is a brilliant idea, is my point. It's a brilliant idea. And the idea of the asset-backed security, this whole notion that this was somehow screwed up and some kind of collusion is just couldn't be more wrong. So I wanted to emphasize, just to underline this, I worry that because finance has been so focused since asset pricing was invented, say, in the 60s and 70s, so focused on the stock market and relegating sort of the debt market to a very small part of any coursework. I mean, finance used to be all about banking. But then came, you know, the brilliant innovation of asset markets, then it took over. All our intuition about transparency and such things are related to the stock market. But what I'm saying is that stock markets here in this slide and money markets are just exactly almost their opposites. And so the idea is they are their opposites, but both are coherent systems. So if you go down the stock market side and ask, first of all, its purpose is risk sharing. Some of it is corporate governance. It has other points, but I'm bringing up the traditional purpose of risk sharing and pricing systemic risk. It's trading in equity. That's a very, what I'm going to call information-sensitive instrument, because every dollar, every piece of information about the stock will influence the value of your equity. You move the equity a little, you move the sort of assets that are behind, or the ideas that are behind the equity, the price changes. So there's a continuous price discovery. And it is important for the continuous price discovery, but not obviously so, that you need to be transparent in these markets. You need to provide information, at least to get to have everybody have sort of symmetric information who are trading in this market. But it's a very expensive system because of the information sensitivity, and the way it's run in order to have this price discovery is not to be bilateral about it, but actually have a organized exchange where, you know, a very large number of trades come in. They are relatively speaking, they are small trades, but there are lots of players. And then a very important matter, it's not despite all this, this is not an urgent market. That is, if you get nervous or uncertain about things, you can just wait till tomorrow, either to buy or sell or something. There is no particular urgency to be trading. So actually the volume is very volatile. Some days it goes up, by a factor of 10, and then other days it goes down and it's very slow, usually when people get nervous. But there's nothing dramatic happen in that sense. And the stock market can actually fall and nothing happens. Nasdaq fell 90% in 2000. There was no financial crisis. And part of it had to do with the fact that no debt was involved, or very little of debt. Money markets are exactly the opposite. But I want to emphasize, this column is a coherent system. It's a sophisticated system that has actually a much shorter history than money markets. We are talking about hundreds of, the modern stock market is no more than at most a couple of 100 years, but if you really talk about the modern, we are talking about less than 100 years. So the money markets is to provide safety, or the word liquidity could also be used. And it's debt, so it's very different from equity. As I just gave the example of the pawn shop, it is to obviate. The whole idea is not to do something where you have to have a lot of information in order to price these markets. By the way, I could add that there are tons of analysts on the left side. In the stock market, we are talking about billions of dollars spent on trying to figure out what these values are, also by analysts and such. On the right side, there are basically no analysts for debt. Nobody is really intensely scrutinizing whether we are talking about corporate debt or treasury debt and so on and so forth. And the market is opaque in the sense that nobody knows the underlying collateral exactly, which was what I gave, these housing prices. And therefore, it is information insensitive. That's the language we are using. And it's bilateral. It works even when two people, just like the pawn shop example suggested. Trading stock bilaterally would be a hard thing to do. Very illiquid, because you worry about adverse selection, you worry about other parties knowing. You don't go and pay something with equity. But one of its important features, it's very urgent. That is repo, one-day repo. If you stop trading or something happens so that it stops trading, the market really comes to a halt and we are near a liquidity crisis. Both markets are liquid, but liquid meaning it's easy to trade, relatively easy to trade, in two totally different ways. The right side is like a bicycle. It's very simple, it's very imprecise, but it's a very functional thing. And it is a bicycle also in the sense that it's very flexible. This is a much more interesting market in many ways. There are a zillion ways of putting together something that is debt, whereas equity is basically a kind of I wouldn't say plain vanilla, because the assets obviously are different, the firms are different, but in its structure it's sort of at some level much less interesting than the money markets. And so just to give you an example, the ECB, after its operations, it's holding, 50 to 70,000 different debt instruments right now. There is the Messi bond, Messi's, assets have been traded and so on. And the complexity of those, 95% estimated or more is totally illiquid because it's just held on it's not traded on any exchange. But it still has the function that I was suggested, which is it's a funding instrument. So here's a slide that explains to you what went wrong in the thinking about transparency. And for the layman, what goes wrong is simply that their thinking is if today transparency is a political correctness issue. So if you are not transparent, whether that be but these markets are, then there's something crooked about it. There's something suspicious. If you are not willing to tell, I'm going to assume something wrong is going on. By the way, there is some logic to that. But what the logic, and the other one is the finance, here this slide exhibits what's the typical error among sophisticated economists, so to speak. We all agree pretty much as economists that symmetric information is the foundation for liquidity. You need to have the same information. But what we overlook is that there are two ways to get to symmetric information. It's not true that transparency and more transparency somehow would create symmetric information. It's the middle line that is the error in our thinking. And it may, by the way, somewhat come from the way we model things. We write simple models down. Almost all models have the feature, that we work with, have the feature that, Oliver knows something, I don't know something, let's put Oliver's information on the table, then we are symmetrically informed. But there's also the case, and actually I would argue more commonly the case, that when you put out information on the table, we suddenly are asymmetrically informed. So you can think about, a mechanic and me looking at the car, and at a distance, the mechanic is much more sophisticated than me about the car value. But if it is the case that it says, it's a Volkswagen 2000, to take my car that I'm driving now, a little old car, but so am I. Looking at the distance of the car that is old and a used car, just having the gross characteristics of that car, I'm fairly comfortable to trade or bid together with the mechanic. But if the mechanic gets a chance to sit down in the car or open the hood of the car or something and gets more information, and I do too, we both get more transparent, then suddenly the mechanic, I'm not going to bid anymore, because for him it means something very different than it means for me. The record doesn't really tell me much of anything, or I don't hear the noises, or I hear the noises but I don't know what they mean, are they serious things, and so on. So you understand that the capacity to process information is always different. There's not a single person, there's nothing, that we could do to actually exactly get symmetric information about things. We will always, depending on our experiences, interpret data differently. And the question is only then, does that matter or not, of course. But the simpler way often to get to symmetric information is to get to a stage where nobody knows anything, so to speak. Nobody has a leg up on, they don't get information. And the way to get it, typically, is to just over-collateralize sufficiently so that there's no interest in the question of what exactly the collateral value is. That's the idea. It's a cheap system to get liquidity. Let's just put enough assets in. And then we don't have to know the exact value of those assets. That's a very fundamental idea behind the money markets. And so let me just say about De Beers, just as an example outside the financial world. De Beers actually puts, this is not quite true, but they basically put their wholesale diamond in bags. And the bags will say 5 characteristics, of which I know some: color, carats, and clarity, and something else that I've forgotten now. But there are 5 characteristics only. And then they sort of say this is a AAA bag, to use the language of money markets, AAA bag, AA bag, B plus bag, and so on. So they will say that these are the qualities inside the bag. Now, what is true also is that they are not exact descriptions of the bond. So if you opened up the bag and you studied them, you could say this bag is more valuable than this bag, even though they are both labeled AAA. They don't allow you to do that. You can't go and look inside the bag. Actually, you can. So there is a little twist to this. You can go and look at the bag just to make sure that there isn't suddenly a blue diamond in the green bag. And then if you point that out to the bears, they will change it and put back. But they have a price on it. They don't change the price. What you cannot go and do and say, I looked at this bag and I thought this isn't quite the average AAA bag. This seems to have more bad diamonds than really should be. They say, okay, you don't have to buy it. You can put it back. You don't accept it to buy it. But by the way, that's it. You don't come anymore here. because we don't want people, you know, they give you the right to open it for inspection also, because if you go and look at where they are blue or green and so on, you can see also the quality. So you are not allowed to reject it more than once in your lifetime. I have once rejected it, so I'm not anymore accessible in the market. So now let's go and take an example of parallel. The De Beers is good because it's so close to the AAA, you know, the asset-backed security markets. They are like things, they are putting hundreds or thousands of little pieces of debt inside a bag, and basically, even though you can actually read it, the file is, you know, this thick, nobody did read it. Yes, they have actually, they are very transparent in the sense of having all the information, but nobody really, they were mechanically being priced. But the most liquid market of all is the to-be-announced market, which is run by the government. And there you buy mortgage securities, bags, and with the specification like De Beers. But actually the mortgages haven't even been issued yet. You know, the loan that eventually will end up in the bag hasn't been made to the person that goes in. So this is a totally, it's not about opacity, we don't even know what's going to go in there because it hasn't been created yet. This is the most liquid market. So if you think somehow that opacity is not a good idea for liquidity, this is the absolute counterexample of it. You can do the MMF, money market mutual funds. They had the information about what their net asset value is every day. They reported it 4 times a year. And even when they reported it, they reported what the value was 60 days ago. They did never want to report today's value. And now the regulations have become more transparent, and now they have to issue the net asset value. And what I will tell, if I get that far, is that I think that's a good idea. That sounds very paradoxical. But what I'm telling you, the reason it's a good idea is that the money market mutual, or could be a good idea, is that the money market mutual fund was too liquid and had some problems for that reason. That the fact that it was so opaque made it so liquid, that it created excess liquidity. It was like a bank. And so transparency sort of puts sands in the wheels unless it makes it less liquid, as it has done, by the way, and shrunk the market significantly in terms of size. It has reduced liquidity, and I happen to think that's a good idea. So do you see, it's a separate issue whether something is liquid or not liquid. Opacity is good for liquidity in money markets. That's my basic position. But it may be a bad thing also that it's that liquid. And I come more to that. And central banks always have historically been very secret. I think I'm very much against the line that the Federal Reserve is going and other banks, you know, forced by public opinion and political opinion. We are going down a bad path, in my view, when it comes to having to reveal information about what our minutes are, what are we thinking about it, and so on. But that's different. Am I doing as well as Oliver? So I'm actually keeping. I have my own. Okay, so let me just jump over directly to one slide here, which is that here is a picture of how debt information in sensitivity comes about, or what it looks. It's just the fact that when you have on the horizontal action the value of collateral, and then you have the red line which describes the final value of debt, where there's a flat part when you are paying it back, or you are able to pay it back, and then there's a 45-degree line when you go into default. This is the cash flow view of debt. Then the black line is the market value line, which is the value of this debt when we go, say, 1 month before it expires, or 2 months and 3 months and so on. We go back. And the point is that, it will always separate a little bit from the red line. That is, but if you go far enough, high enough in the collateral value, the black line will basically hug the red line. So it's so over-collateralized. And then you see that if the value changes in this picture at the, I don't know if this is working, if the value changes here, it doesn't matter. So nobody is going to bother looking into the information at that level because it's over-collateralized. There's no interest in it. You know, the interest, of course, affects loan values, but the interest rates that's a separate market that's trading, and that's transparent, and people can compute the issue about the interest value. So the thing is, so that's the way to sort of figuratively explain why it's information insensitive, this region. Let me just say an interesting little point for the economist. Debt contracts, we draw this picture this way, but the debt contract never says that if your assets are worth, you know, if your house is worth $1,350,000, you know, then you will be paying back $100 or $100,000. Okay, there is no reference to the house value per se. It just has a state which says you pay back, or if you don't pay back and you end up in this region here, then you will have to discover price. So you see, you have price discovery in this market also, but it's not what you would really like to have. You end up there. It's a bad situation. It's an expensive exercise to find out the price, and as we will see, that's the cause of the crisis. So here we come on this is, by the way, I take the financial crisis to be evidence of this whole way of thinking. I've now set you up for the fact that debt is information insensitive by design. Okay, now it has a dark side. And the dark side is that relying on debt, on securitization, course raising, mechanical rules, and so on, that keeps up liquidity in the good times, and things are wonderful because nobody is spending very much money over, you know, having price discovery the same way as in the equity market. But it pushes risks in the tail. I didn't get into the details of how you can make the debt more liquid, but shortening, for instance, its maturity is a very effective way of getting the market line to be closer to the red line. But you know, somewhere the risk has to go, and it goes into the tail. And so the social trade-off is all about the fact that the more you try to squeeze out, you know, you go closer to the, you know, it may be over-collateralized the first 50%, or the loan-to-value ratio may be 70 or 66.6% or something like that. But then when the demand increases for liquidity, it goes to 70 and 80 and 90 and so on. They are squeezing more out of the assets that's available in the economy in order to get more liquidity to fund various projects. That's a separate issue about the cycle, but that's the idea. And then eventually you are in the state where you have the trade-off that opacity enhances liquidity, the ignorance enhances liquidity, but it also increases risk and the cost of a crisis. So here is a big picture of a little messy picture of the crisis, but whereas we used to be in the information-sensitive region, if you push far enough, you may end up in the information sensitive region. Did I say insensitive? Here is the insensitive region. When this detaches sufficiently far, and then there is a risk of actually going into default, that becomes the information sensitive region. And people start to get nervous. It's like almost two states. They suddenly start asking questions. And when they ask questions, they realize there are no answers, because nobody has really found out very much. There is no market this way, bilateral contracts for the most part. There is no market in which you could suddenly discover price. That's not how these markets are set up. They are corporate bond markets and so on, but they are small relative to the size of the money market. And so that is a troublesome situation. And here you see from one of the triggers, it didn't do really the crisis, but here you see I don't want to go into the details of the story, but this line here, it runs from July 06 to January 08. So this line here shows you that people were all, these little dots are bilateral trades. So you saw them being priced, everybody priced them pretty much the same, these bonds. This is a batch, actually. These are real trades, you know, coming from, I don't want to explain even. These are complicated markets in terms of detail, but everybody had the same view, basically, about what. And it wasn't an informed view that this is the value, it was the feeling there is enough money here. And then suddenly this bear fund collapsed in July 2007. This is not the picture of the bear fund, it's just that when this bear fund collapsed in 2007, its effect on these AA marks, suddenly people woke up and said, ooh, we have also these kind of assets. We don't exactly know at all what the assets are, but they are somewhat similar to this fund that just failed to, you know, deliver. You know, they had to close it down because they had a run on the bear fund. That was a big contagion into a lot of other funds saying, hey, this may actually happen. And you see here how suddenly private information made these spreads between the values. Now people had to try to grow for a price. And you see how sort of poorly they priced similarly. There was no price discovery. And they traded at different prices depending on what kind of information, private information they had. So private information became relevant. And yeah. When did I start? And how? I thought it was 50 minutes. It's 40 minutes. You were very tough on. Oh, okay. So then I just stop here and say that it's a bad situation. I run into this situation right now. I'm sorry. I looked carefully at the watch. I thought I had the instructions about 50 minutes. But let me just say that you have heard the mechanics of how why we have liquidity in the way I was describing, and it has with it the crisis always. The downside of debt is that you end up in a situation where you have to have price discovery, and that's really very close to a crisis. And that's also, by the way, the reason. It's always about debt. All financial crises are always about debt. They are never about equity, unless we are talking about the margins of equity. And I would love to answer your questions, but I don't have time for questions.
There will be time for some questions.
Oh.
Thank you very much. So there will be time for 1 or 2 questions. Please. Yes, we have one up there. Stefan.
Okay. Oh. Hi, my name is Stefan Johnson. I was wondering, should one interpret your last slide that the spreading price, the failed efforts to price the assets as that maybe this financial crisis could have been avoided or dampened if people wouldn't have gotten so worried about it, if they would have just ignored this bear failing? Yeah.
Well, what happens, they were rational, you can't say, don't worry. Of course, they are trying to say, don't worry, but as soon as you are starting to explain to people that they don't have to worry, they start really to worry. So, this is some very thin information, so all sorts of signals like this are not very good. Let me say what is I want to say one more thing from my slides, using yours. The way to go is not to be more transparent. So the reaction to the crisis, many people say, let's open the bags and show you. And EU did that exactly. They showed how exposed are the different banks to Greek debt. It was a disastrous move. You know, I think that's when the European crisis really got caught on fire, because people, you know, got to see what was in the bags. And it's not clear everybody thought it was terrible, but they said somebody might think it's terrible and I'm not going to touch it. You know, so the way out of crisis is always the same. You recapitalize. And it essentially always means the government has to recapitalize, unless you go into the 18th century and so on. Then the government didn't come in, but they had insurance agreement among banks. So that's the important lesson, is this simple conception of understanding this mechanism makes it clear. Don't become transparent, especially not in a crisis. It may be good to be more transparent in good times in order to slow the train. But in crisis, and the evidence is overwhelming historically, that that's what happens. You become opaque, you know, you take a bank holiday, or you say what Draghi said, whatever it takes. Notice, Draghi's whatever it takes suddenly calmed down the European markets. Firstly, because everybody suspected that, or thought Germany is now behind it, which is true. But nobody to this day knows what that exactly means. So all the experts that you are now good with Excel spreadsheets and so on, they don't have any material to work with. You know, whatever it takes you put in your Excel spreadsheet, it doesn't calculate, you know. But if you say, yes, we have $3 trillion, they had $1 trillion, by the way, when the European crisis hit. They had $1 trillion to support the banking system. Not enough. Spreads kept staying just the same or going higher. But whatever it takes, and you better believe me, that worked. I don't think there's a more opaque statement than whatever it takes. Because the question is whatever it means. Yes.
Okay. Any final question for Bengt or Oliver?
I have a final question. Was this opaque enough?
We have to think about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.